Statistics show that American women are having children later and later in life, and new strides in fertility treatment is making it easier for families to achieve pregnancy. But new findings when it comes to IVF or in vitro fertilization shows that some women who thought they missed their window of having a healthy baby due to tests showing abnormalities within the embryos may still have had a healthy baby after all, despite these test findings. Very complex issue. Here to talk more about it is Dr. Sabrina Fabi. Thank you so much for being here, first of all.
Thanks for having me, Misha.
So this is both good news and somewhat sad news for some women who may have passed on a transfer due to tests showing that the embryos were not viable. Before we get to all of that, because this is so complex, first of all, explain IVF and the testing for embryos to be transferred to a woman.
Right, so basically IVF stands for in vitro fertilization, and that's when we take the egg out of a woman and in a petri dish we fertilize it with a sperm. And then once that has been fertilized, those are called embryos, and those embryos are allowed to basically grow like they would in the womb of a woman if the fertilization would have happened in the uterus. And so on this petri dish, those cells, that embryo, are typically tested at about day 5 to see if there's any genetic abnormality. And when we talk about genetics, we're talking about the DNA that we all know about. We have 23 chromosomes, which are basically 2 pairs of chromosomes. And so what happens is commonly, very commonly actually, is that one of those cells will be tested and it'll come back as abnormal because one of the 6 cells taken is only showing 1 chromosome as opposed to 2.
Okay, so you have a certain amount of embryos that come back, they're tested, and they find that they're abnormal. Now, before this new findings that we're going to talk about today,
yes,
what would have happened though when you find an abnormality within an embryo before?
Right, so if you would have taken that abnormal embryo, then if you had implanted it back in the uterus, which is basically what happens when somebody gets pregnant, right? The sperm fertilizes the egg, the person gets pregnant. Miscarriages typically occur because genetically that embryo may have been abnormal. Same happens if you genetically put an abnormally genetic embryo in a uterus. It may miscarry, or that woman may go to term and the baby may be abnormal, genetically abnormal. And so, or they may get pregnant and not know and have to wait until basically week 10 to find out through other testing whether the baby is truly abnormal. So they've been pregnant for 10 weeks and have gone through that entire process, which can be, quite life-altering and stressful for women.
So doctors would then, to avoid all of that, they wouldn't do a transfer if there were abnormalities.
Right.
According to this new study though, so what's the new information?
So the new information is that when they took, in one study back in 2016, when they actually went to test, let's say some of these embryos and then actually they proved to be abnormal, and then they let them go to term, only in 18% of cases did it actually end up coming out abnormal. So that just showed us that the test wasn't very sensitive, because even though it was abnormal, it didn't mean that the baby was necessarily not going to come out normal. Then in another study, they actually tested one time, and then they tested in a different lab that same cell milieu, and they found that you got 50% of the time different test results. So one said it was okay, and the other one said it was abnormal.
So what does this mean for families moving forward?
I know, it means that, well, we know that basically women at the age of 40 have really every single month a 5% chance to get pregnant. And so the chances are really, really low. I think what it tells us, at least in the IVF world, is that we have to find more specific tests that can really guide us. And it may actually encourage women that may come back with an abnormal test result from, when they do these embryo testings, to maybe get it checked again, or maybe just move forward with the pregnancy and see at 10 weeks later. It really means that it may not necessarily mean that the baby's going to be abnormal. And so it does provide a little bit of hope and direction for future studies.
Certainly does. All right, very interesting and important topic. Dr. Sabrina Fabi, thank you so much always for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Misha.